This document, entitled Our Pandemic Year, a COVID-19 Timeline, summarizes pretty well what happened. In the beginning of winter 2020, the virus first affected a couple of people who had traveled from and lived in Seattle and Chicago. Their symptoms were mild fever, a cough, and shortness of breath. 2 weeks later, there were about 15 known cases in the United States. Doctors closely monitored the infected patients and their contacts. Travel to China, since all the known cases were related to it, became consequently restricted starting February the 2nd. Travel to Europe, other Asian countries, and the rest of the world went on. Because testing was scarce, most of the COVID-19 cases went undetected. Health officials were not aware of the reality of the outbreak until weeks after it occurred. Although many of those infections disappeared, outbreaks occurred in cities such as New York, Seattle, Dallas, Miami, and the Bay Area. Tests delivered by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention were ineffective due to poor laboratory practices and led to false negatives. By the end of February, top health experts warned that the infectious disease was spreading at a fast rate and that the only way to contain it was to engage in social distancing measures. Government officials ignored the health experts' warnings, did not make testing largely available, and let Americans go on with their lives as usual, as was the case in many other developed countries at the beginning of the outbreak. At the same time, a laboratory in Seattle uncovered the first case of infection, which was not linked to travel to China. The Seattle flu study showed that the outbreak in Seattle was spreading in at least 14 other states, while in New York City, as many as 10,000 cases had gone undetected. At the time, social distancing measures were still not in place, and the virus spread from New York to other places, as contagious people kept traveling to and from New York City. Studies show that the Hudson Valley and the New Orleans outbreaks are directly linked to the NYC outbreak. On March the 13th, when travel restrictions were implemented, it was too late to stop the spread. 3 days later, the first social distancing measures, which recommended that Americans keep 6 feet away from each other, avoid gatherings, and refrain from participating in community events or traveling, were also implemented. After the Trump announcement, states started issuing stay-at-home orders and closed schools and businesses in what was to be known as the Great Lockdown. Although those measures did not stop the spread of the virus, they temporarily avoided its exponential growth. Before we move on in the timeline, we're going to focus on the pandemic and the recession that followed. The unemployment rate rose from 3.5% in February to 14.7% in April, when 6.6 million Americans lost their jobs in the first week of April, the highest level recorded since 1941. This represented the loss of the jobs for more than 33 million people. The unemployment rate then declined again in the summer and reached 7.9% just before the presidential elections. The impact of the Great Lockdown on the labor market, according to the Brookings Institute, has been the quickest and most severe in recent US history. Many firms reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic by reducing their operations. Quote unquote. The jobs lost were mostly leisure and hospitality jobs, and the impact was not as severe for large businesses as for small ones. People employed in the retail industry, education, and health services were also impacted severely. The airline and automobile industries were deeply impacted as international airlines drastically reduced traffic, and the big three car manufacturers agreed to suspend production in March. Moreover, home construction fell by a third. The United States, compared to other OECD countries, was hit the hardest in terms of unemployment. But the shock did not last long, and the country seemed to have recovered better and faster than other OECD countries. The US unemployment rate forecast for 2021 is slightly above 5%, whereas the other OECD countries' rate forecast is above 8%. American consumer spending decreased sharply as early as March 2020, and its immediate consequence was the decline of GDP. However, even if GDP contracted at an unprecedented rate in the second quarter of 2020, quarterly GDP had never experienced a drop greater than 3% since record-keeping began in 1947. It regained a positive growth faster than in other OECD countries. To sum it up, you should remember that the GDP contracted at a never-seen rate, that consumer spending decreased sharply, but the shock did not last long, and the country recovered better and faster than other OECD countries. One of the characteristics of the Great Lockdown and the response to the COVID recession that occurred was, according to CNBC economic analyst Jim Cramer, quote, one of the greatest wealth transfers in history, end quote. According to an Oxfam report published in January 2021 and entitled The Inequality Virus, I quote, the 1,000 richest people on the planet recouped their COVID-19 losses within just 9 months. But it could take more than a decade for the world's poorest to recover from the economic impact of the pandemic, reveals a new Oxfam report today. The Inequality Virus is being published on the opening day of the World Economic Forum's Davos agenda. The 10 richest people in the world include Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, Tesla founder Elon Musk, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, and Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg. During and after the Great Recession, the Obama administration favored an activist government. It attacked the unequal distribution of wealth and social welfare with the controversial Health Care Reform Law, aka the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of March 2010, which offered Americans their first comprehensive national health system. Nevertheless, the government's response to the Great Recession was deemed by many as, to use Paul Krugman's word, a failure of policy. President Obama declared on January 27, 2010, I quote, "The markets are now stabilized and we've recovered most of the money we spent on the banks," unquote. In December 2017, Congress passed and President Donald Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, among its various provisions, reduced the corporate tax rate and lowered the individual tax rate for those with the highest incomes. The new taxes took effect on the 1st of January 2018 and were extended through 2020. The tax cuts for corporations are permanent, but those for individuals are scheduled to expire after 2025. The aim of these tax cuts is to boost the economy and productivity of the nation. Before the Great Lockdown started, the American economy was in good shape, although there were, at the federal and international levels, signs that a recession could be on the way. According to the Brookings Institute, while voluntary social distancing and local lockdowns that took effect in March 2020 worked initially to isolate and drive down infections, those actions precipitated a severe economic downturn. The demand shock resulting from quarantine, unemployment and business closures dealt a blow to consumer services. Lockdown measures and social distancing reduced the economy's capacity to produce goods and services. In order to avoid a long-lasting crisis, the response to the Great Lockdown needs to be twofold. The government needs to respond to the pandemic outbreak and to the economic downturn conjointly. The Great Lockdown is actually a response in itself, as it includes governmental measures and its consequences are manifold, as we explained earlier. It means that the better the sanitary response from the government is, the better the economy of the nation will be, and vice versa. Unfortunately, from the start, most governments' responses to this new crisis were lacking. Most governments were unprepared for a crisis of such amplitude, so America is no exception. Health experts were the first to ask for a more active response, but it took weeks for the Trump administration to implement lockdown measures and social distancing. At first, the administration only limited travel and asked Americans to stay home if they were sick, although it was not compulsory. Little by little, individual states issued stay-at-home orders, and most of the country had done the same by the end of March. San Francisco and Seattle put in place lockdown measures and closed down businesses and schools before the virus could move into exponential growth. It was not the case in New York City, which was severely hit. In the latter months, the South and the West, which had at first been relatively spared by major outbreaks, were also hit. Despite the exceptional American testing capacity, it was almost impossible to rely on testing across the country that would help understand the spread of the disease, because the government did not establish a systemic testing policy at the national level. There are three major sets of strategies that government can use against the virus. It can let the virus run its course in order to reach herd immunity in the fastest way possible. The cost of this strategy in dollars and lives is so outstanding that it's been deemed ineffective. It can use suppression strategies and try to achieve zero COVID with proactive measures that prevent the virus from spreading when the cases are extremely low. Suppression measures are, for the most part, rapid and high-quality testing, contact tracing, and quarantine. They also include measures similar to the ones used in mitigation strategies. Suppression means reducing the R effective and infection rate, RT, to less than 1 as swiftly as possible. According to COVID Act NAG glossary, the value of RT represents the number of people that a single infected person goes on to infect in a specific area at a specific time. This strategy has proven to be quite effective so far in countries such as New Zealand and Australia. However, doubts have been raised. The third strategy that a country can use is a mitigation strategy, such as limiting travel, wearing masks, imposing social distancing, or simply staying home. This is the choice of the United States and most of European countries. Mitigation strategies aim at slowing down the transmission of the virus or flattening the curve. The curve refers to the epidemiological curve, which means that the cases are spread out over a longer period of time, which gives to the healthcare system more time to deal with each individual case and prevents it from being overwhelmed. The curve refers to the curves in an epidemiological chart of projected COVID cases, according to the NPR news article entitled Flattening the Pandemic's Curve, Why Staying Home Now Can Save Lives. The curve refers to the curves in an epidemiological chart of projected COVID cases that demonstrate the spread of the virus with and without protective measures. With protective measures, the peaks in the curve will be less steep as cases will increase less dramatically over the same period of time. As an addition to the two most effective strategies that governments can use, vaccination helps prevent the spread of the disease. As of May 2021, the American Food and Drug Administration, FDA, has authorized 3 COVID vaccines, 2 of them being mRNA vaccines from 3 manufacturers for emergency use: Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, and Janssen. Although Trump wanted to appear as a true Republican, seemed disinclined to use the federal government to fight against the pandemic. In fact, he did, although it took 6 weeks. His successor vowed to deliver 100 million shots of the COVID vaccine within its first 100 days in office. To achieve this goal, the government launched a website to help people get vaccinated. In his March 11, 2021 speech on the anniversary of the COVID-19 shutdown, President Biden declared, "Look, we know what we need to do to beat the virus. Tell the truth. Follow the scientists and the science. Work together. Put trust and faith in our government to fulfill its most important function, which is protecting the American people. No function more important. We need to remember the government isn't some foreign force in a distant capital. No, it's us, all of us. We, the people." Hence, both presidents did, reluctantly or willingly, use the government to provide social and economic assistance to American individuals and families. The American Congress passed a $2.3 trillion economic stimulus piece of legislation, which was signed into law on March 27, 2020. It is called the CARES Act, which stands for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act, and is equivalent to roughly 9% of the US GDP, which is exceptional as it represents one of the largest stimulus packages in American history. Its aim is to provide relief to a large portion of the American population through direct payouts, loans, and grants to American individuals, small businesses, and industries, as well as public institutions, and is meant to last longer than the Great Lockdown itself. Some of its programs were indeed renewed thanks to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 signed by Trump on December 27, 2020, and the American Rescue Plan Act signed by Biden in March 2021, which added $900 million to the relief package. As the senator said, this was truly, I quote, a time when the American people need their government, end quote. And so there was an apparent consensus that prompt government intervention was necessary. The American response to the crisis was thus hesitant at first. And President Trump is accused of having played down the seriousness of the virus and of having ignored the recommendations coming from health experts and scientists all through and sometimes beyond the crisis. Trump claimed that the federal government should not intervene, and assumed responsibility fell to the states. Even a few weeks after Trump and Congress signed the CARES Act into law, the president insisted that the virus would go away quickly. He said, "When it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away." This is a quote from April 10, 2020. The American government response was deemed slow and lacking in the first weeks of the Great Lockdown. However, once the federal government set itself in motion and started taking action, it took drastic measures to combat the virus. President Biden and Vice President Harris have issued a 7-point plan to beat COVID-19. Its main tenets are to listen to science, ensure public health decisions are informed by public health professionals, promote trust, transparency, common purpose, and accountability in their government. How hard is it to assess the responses of the American government to the crisis? Doesn't it depend on the type of crisis the government has to fight against? Although responses were deemed slow and somewhat lacking by many observers so far, the US as a whole seems to be able to recover faster than other countries. We shall nevertheless remain cautious observers. We might simply infer that policy success and recovery can be ensured only when the government intervenes promptly and the people trust the government and government representatives to act on their behalf. Still, policymakers have been accused of acting only in their own interests and the interests of those who are already privileged. As we already mentioned, the US is and remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. In terms of wealth, the gap between the top 10% and the bottom 10% has been widening, and crises such as the Great Recession and the Great Lockdown have affected the poorest Americans above all. Can American government responses to crisis, the rebounding economies and the swift recoveries that followed, be characterized as exceptional? Is 21st century America exceptional or just a mighty survival of repeated crises? In Unit 4, we will deal with the issue of socioeconomic inequalities generated by repeated crises, but not only this. It is no secret the American dream is not achievable for too many Americans, and the latter are increasingly aware that socioeconomic opportunities are limited. Opportunities have indeed always been limited for certain categories of people while being widely accessible to others.